tragedy of the commons and the tragedy of the anti-commons. But I think we should reserve that for the discussion. We have again a 1 hour discussion today and proceed now to the economic analysis of contract law. Let me first start with some general observation, economic and legal observation, on what a contract is, what a contract requires. A contract is a mutual promise. That is basically a contract. I promise you somewhat, you promise me somewhat. And this is based on that is what we call a voluntary transaction. Is this based on a meeting of minds? We have the same thing in mind when we make the contract. That is a requirement for a contract. And a contract is right, a contract. This is law. This is the law which we give ourselves. It is the law just as the Constitution is a law, or the law in the books is the law. We make our own laws when we make a contract. But the law is, of course, not privately enforced, but publicly enforced, because we do not have any more private enforcement like self-help or only in very special cases. Now, the contract is one of the most important, if not the important, legal institution. And a market economy without contracts is simply not possible, is not even thinkable. A market economy is based on contracts, and contracts are the most important, perhaps together with property, the most important institution to make a market economy function. But still, when lawyers talk about contracts, they often do not use such a, let's say, consequentialist view. Consequentialist always means what is something good for? When it is social, when is it socially good? When is something socially good? When is it efficient, or when does it increase welfare? Or when does it increase utility, or the utility level, or the welfare level in a society? These are all consequentialist perspective. In that sense, an institution is instrumental. It has no intrinsic value, but it is instrumental for something else which has an intrinsic value. So the increase of welfare of a country has an intrinsic value, but the contract as such is an instrument and not something which has value in itself. But this is not the law many lawyers look at it. Lawyers say that contract is also an outflow of the idea of private autonomy. So people should be autonomous, and they should, if possible, regulate their own affairs by themselves, and that this is a value in itself. From an economic point of view, that is not a value by itself. An economist would say, well, you know, if we would have a mechanism which increases the welfare better than the contracts, then we would prefer that mechanism. So the contracts have not an intrinsic value. They are not by itself good, but only good if they increase, if they have some desired consequences for the society. Now, a an element of contract, and a fundamental element also of contract, that if we speak of contracts, then there is already implied in a contract the idea of fairness, whatever this exactly means. Because when we talk of a voluntary promise of two or three or more voluntary promises, then this excludes cases of duress and all these things which can happen. And it is totally uncontested that if such things happen, then either the contract is void, it is not a contract at all, or the contract is not void but can be avoided if one party wants to avoid it. Right? That is now one of the most important aspects from an economic point of view about contracts is that under certain conditions, which we will discuss, they are not always fulfilled and often they are not fulfilled at all, but under certain conditions, a fair contract, I'm talking only of a fair contract here, a fair contract is a Pareto improvement, and therefore something which we say, what economists at least say, if we have a Pareto improvement, then this is good for the society. It improves. It is the definition of the improvement of a society. Because remember what a Pareto improvement is. Pareto improvement is any change in the society by which at least one person in the society is made better off than before, and nobody is made worse off. It could be 2 or 3 or 4 or all persons, but at least one must be better off. A contract is now a mechanism by which at least 2 persons, a fair contract, which at least makes 2 persons better off, right? And if then this criterion that nobody is made worse off is fulfilled, then the contract leads to a Pareto improvement. Now, you know that a contract is not something which happens once in a year, but it happens hundreds of millions of times every day in a country like India. So if we have 100 million or more, 1 billion fair contracts every day in India, then we have 1 billion Pareto improvements every day in India if these contracts do not lead to negative effects to other people. And therefore, one can argue that the contract, the institution of contract, is one of the most powerful and most pervasive institutions to generate Pareto improvements. Got the point? Of course, this is not always the case. This is often not the case. A fair contract does not guarantee that negative effects to third parties are not, do not occur. And we will discuss here the question, how should the law react to this if they do not occur? Should that be of importance for the law, for contract law or other fields of the law, or should that not be become of importance? A very important aspect of contract law, and I'm talking about common law as much as of civil contract law, is the freedom, so-called freedom of contract. Now, what does this mean? in contract law, like property law, developed out of Roman law. But in Roman law, in the classical Roman law, such a thing as freedom of contract did not exist. But we had a kind of numerus clausus of contracts. That is, we had a limited number in a closed list of contracts, which were valid, and all other contracts were not valid. So in Roman law, we had the sales contract, the credit contract, the service contract, the housing contract, and I think forgot something, but 5 or 6 types of contract. They were well elaborated traditionally, but all other contracts. So if two parties would agree on something which you cannot nicely fit into this category of a sale or credit or whatever, let's say a leasing contract, they would be regarded classically as so-called as a pactum nudum, a naked contract. And a naked contract has no legal force. It is not forbidden, but it is not enforced by a court. That was for a long time the situation, and it was then only in the Middle Ages that legal scholarship and courts gradually came to the conclusion that they say, no, we don't need a closed list. Every contract for which you have a meeting of mind, every contract is enforceable. And from that comes the famous phrase, pacta sunt servanda, which means all contracts must be served. All contracts are part of the law enforcement. All fair contracts are valid. The economic importance of this change is perhaps, you can easily understand that, for instance, in the numerous clauses in this closed list of the original list of Roman contracts, there existed no insurance contract. And only when in the Middle Ages this idea of the freedom of contract was introduced in Europe, in continental Europe, they invented the insurance contract, which gave rise to the insurance industry. And before, such a contract was not enforceable because we had only this closed list. But this is different. Today, any contract is a valid contract. Any contract which is based on a meeting of minds and on promises, whatever the content of the contract is. See what I mean? Now, to understand the economic function of a contract, I have to develop here some concepts which for the economists are not new, so you can relax a little bit, but for the others who have no economic background, they are absolutely important, because otherwise you cannot understand how an economist analyzes the importance of a contract and also the gain we have from a contract. Now there are two concepts which I have to explain here. The first concept is the concept of consumer surplus, and the second, the concept of producer surplus. We have always, or very often, we say that a contract should be to the mutual gain. It should be to the mutual advantage, right? You have all heard this. We cooperate in the mutual advantage. And we say if a contract is in the mutual advantage, we use this ancient Greek word synallagmatic contract. That is a synallagmatic contract. That is a contract which is aimed at making both parties better off. But what does this exactly mean? Can we give it a precise meaning? When we say something is of the mutual advantage, this is very loose talk, right? Mutual advantage, mutual is clear, but advantage is very loose talk. And economists have always been, let's say, eager to replace such loose talk by more precise concepts. And one much more precise concept than advantage is the idea of surplus, consumer and producer surplus. Now, what does it mean? Now, assume, for instance, you go shopping. You go to a shopping mall and you see you see a pair of shoes which you like. Say, oh, these shoes are wonderful. I would really like to buy them. And then you ask yourself, how much maximum would I pay for the shoes? What is the maximum price I would be willing to pay? And this maximum price you would be willing to pay for the shoes, this price the economists call the willingness to pay. That is the highest price somebody would be willing to pay for something, right? So you like the shoes, the design and everything, so you go inside and before you have said, well, the shoes should not cost not more than 10,000 rupees, right? Now you go into the shop and the salesperson tells you, yeah, you can have the shoes for 8,000 rupees, okay? Then you buy these shoes for 8,000 rupees. And then we say, your benefit, the benefit you made from buying these shoes is the difference between your willingness to pay and the price. So your willingness to pay was 10,000 and the price was 8,000. So you made a benefit, a consumer surplus of 2,000 rupees, and that is your benefit. Got the point? Pardon? What? Oh yeah, consumer, yeah, you are right. Oh yeah, yes, okay, there's something wrong here. But we can change it later, it's too much time. So equally you can ask whether the producer is willing, whether the producer makes an equivalent gain, and the answer is yes, because any seller of a product has what we call a so-called reservation price. That is the lowest price for which below which he would not sell it. Usually, this is the average cost, but this is not necessary to assume. We simply can assume that there is a reservation price, that is the lowest price at which he would be willing to sell it, and then there is a market price, and if the market price is higher, he will sell it. If it's lower, he will not sell it. And whenever the market price is higher, then he makes also a surplus, which we call the producer surplus. And therefore we have a, in any transaction, by definition, otherwise it would not happen, we have, let's say, a buyer surplus and a seller surplus, a consumer surplus and a producer surplus. The consumer surplus, the difference between the willingness to pay for the consumer and the price, and the producer surplus, the difference between the price and the reservation price. That is the lowest possible price, the cost, and usually, for simplicity's sake, the cost, but not necessarily. And then, when we add up these two, the consumer and the producer surplus, we get what the contract has actually produced, namely a total surplus, which is the sum total of producer and consumer surplus. And that is how economists conceptualize and try to quantify what it means when we talk about mutual advantage. Yeah, thank you for pointing me this out. Of course, consumer surplus has here to be replaced by producer surplus and the other way around. Okay. Now, so far we have looked at one contract, one single contract, right? Now we look at contracts at the consequence of all contracts on a market, let's say on the shoe market, right? Now assume we have one market. Oh no, shoe market is not a good example. Let's say better the rice market, the market for rice, because rice is a relatively homogeneous good, shoes are not. Now you have here at the vertical axis, you have the price of a product, on the horizontal axis the quality, and you have one particular price, and you have the demand function, that is, this function here is the demand function, and the demand function simply means that with an increasing price, the demand the demand goes up, and with decreasing price, the demand, no, that is with increasing price, the demand shrinks, and with decreasing price, the demand increases. And you see, at this price here, the consumers or the buyers will buy this amount here, because until this amount there is always a consumer surplus. Here is the point where the willingness to pay is just equal to the price, and therefore here it is lower, and therefore here if the consumers would buy this quantity, they would make a negative consumer surplus, and therefore they would not buy it. But here we have always a positive consumer surplus, and this blue line, or this blue shaded triangle, is now the total consumer surplus on this market. And we can make the same exercise for the producer surplus. You know, we have a similar line, and we have here we have the supply curve. The supply curve is usually the marginal cost curve. That is basic microeconomics. I cannot extend this. This is the most basic microeconomics, but it is here possible, necessary to understand it. And this is here the total producer surplus, the difference between the market price and the reservation prices at different quantities. And then if you integrate this, of course, then you get this total surplus in a competitive market, the sum total of producer surplus and producer and consumer surplus. Now, there is one important proposition which comes from the theory of perfect competition. The theory of perfect competition tells us that in a competitive market, in equilibrium, the sum total of all surpluses, all consumer and producer surplus, if we add them up, reaches a maximum. It cannot be any more increased, the sum total. So that means that any move from a situation in which we are not in equilibrium to a situation we get the market equilibrium, any improve is an Kaldor-Hicks improvement. It is not, however, something which is Pareto. It's always Pareto improving. You know, that is not the case. Yeah, there is one important theorem of welfare economics which says that if all markets in the economy are competitive markets, equilibrium prices maximize the sum total of consumer and producer surplus in the economy. That is, if we have a market system which works perfectly, and if we have a contract law which also works perfectly, and if the market transactions are carried out by contracts, then contracts lead to a maximization of the sum total of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Okay. Skip this. Now, I told you that with that in a single transaction, in a fair contract, the buyer and the seller both have an advantage, the consumer and the producer surplus, right? And we also said that this is a Pareto improvement if there are no negative effects to third parties. Now I come to these negative effects to third parties. Because if it would always be a Pareto, if a fair contract would always lead to a Pareto improvement, then there would be very, very few and only very weak arguments against a full freedom of contract. You know, if we could prove that every transaction makes some people better off and nobody worse off, then, you know, everybody who would challenge freedom of contract would at least have a difficult task, at least among economists, right? But this is unfortunately not the case. We have often negative to third parties, and these negative effects, however, and this is now very important, have to be subcategorized into two categories. We call these negative effects also either external effects or pecuniary effects. And the importance of, or the, let's say, the importance of both of them are quite different. Let me, you know, the so-called external effects are effects of contract on third parties which may lead to an efficiency loss of the contract. But the pecuniary effects do not. Now, for instance, assume the following. Assume that a coal mine and a steel corporation make a contract the steel corporation buys more coal from the coal mine. This coal is, this contract makes both better off, but it is not a Pareto improvement because this allows them to increase their production, and therefore the steel company makes more pollution and the pollution is higher. So we have an external effect which we have to deduct from the consumer surplus and the consumer and the producer surplus, right? So the total gain for the society is much less in that case than the consumer surplus and the producer surplus, right? This is one. These are so-called, we call these technical external effects. Technical external effects are effects of which can arise from the freedom of contract, effects on third parties, which reduce the productivity of resources, of other resources in the economy. And now we come to the so-called pecuniary effects. They leave the productivity of resources, of other resources, totally unaffected, but they still can lead to negative effects of others. Now, I try here to illustrate this. Now, you know, we have a starting point. We have again here a quantity and a price in any good. Let's say this is the price, let's say, for bananas. Now we have a demand curve. We have a supply curve here for bananas. And here we have this equilibrium point. And we have here, that is not in the graph, we have here the equilibrium price. And we have here the equilibrium quantity. And this triangle here would then be the total surplus from all contract in the market, right? Now assume that for whatever reason, which we do not analyze here, but can be any reason, the taste of people changes. Oh yeah, thank you. The taste of people changes, so the people become more, they like bananas more, and they buy more bananas. And economically, this means that at any price, so this is, so that at any price, now so at this price, originally people would buy no bananas at all. Now, because they like bananas more, even at this price, they would buy this amount of bananas. Or at this price, before they would buy this amount of bananas, here this amount, and now they buy this amount, and so on. So what we can see is that as a consequence of this shift of tastes, the demand function is shifted north to the northeast, right? So this is the new demand function here. Okay. Now what we see here, we have more this is the supply function, that is the, the reserve price here of the suppliers. Here the supply function. Now we get, this is the new equilibrium point, and this is the new quantity, and this is the new price. Now what you see here is the following. The old surplus from all contract was this triangle here, right? That is the surplus, producer and consumer surplus. Now the total surplus is this triangle here. So the number of contracts has increased, the number of surpluses has also increased, the total surplus has increased. But is this a Pareto improvement? Why not?
So in the process of shifting equilibrium,
Yeah.
there would be loss of certain surplus would be shifted from consuming workers to producing workers. So there would be some people who are worse.
Yes. Look, assume that you belonged to the people who has always loved bananas, right? So you have always bought bananas for this, no, for this price here, right? And depending on, so you had this surplus. But now, assume that your tastes have not changed at all, but other people like bananas more. But your taste is exactly the same as before. Then you are a loser. You have become a loser because you pay now this price here. Sorry, what is it? You pay this price. The old price was here, the new price is here. And therefore, your consumer surplus has decreased. You see, that is very important to understand. What we have here is we have an equilibrium, and in the equilibrium we have the maximum possible sum totals of consumer surpluses and producer surpluses. Then we have some distortion of that equilibrium because more people like bananas, and the demand, we have a shift of the demand curve, and we have a new equilibrium, and the new equilibrium has also this nice property that now the synalagmatic, the surplus, consumer plus producer surplus, is even bigger. But the change from A to B, from the first point to the next point, does not mean that everybody is better off. Many are better off, but some are worse off, especially those who were in the market and whose tastes have not changed. That is, they have the same willingness to pay for bananas, but the price has increased, and therefore they have a lower consumer surplus. See what I mean?
The taste is the same, but since for the same amount of banana they are paying more, that is why the consumer surplus has reduced.
Exactly. Yeah. So these are the so-called pecuniary effects, and the first one, actually, I came to this by chance, because a couple of months ago, just when I had nothing better to do, I read in this book of David Ricardo, Principle of Economics, one of the great books of economics. And it is really interesting. Ricardo was really a great man. He has already clearly seen this aspect, even though at that time when he wrote, the concepts of consumer surplus and producer surplus did not exist at all. That came only in the late 19th century with Alfred Marshall. Well, Ricardo brings this example. He says, assume that the King of England dies. Then at the time, 200 years back, when the king dies, all people in the country had to go black for half a year. So it was regarded as something very severe, and everybody had to show his loyalty to the king and his grief and so on by by wearing black clothes for, I think 6 months or so. That was a duty. I don't know whether it was a legal duty, but it was as much as a legal duty. That's how Ricardo points it out. And he then says, well, then what happens here? The price goes up, more people have to buy this, and the others, of course, who always went black for whatever reason, for professional reason or what, they have to pay higher prices, and therefore they are worse off. So Ricardo has already seen this. And now, what we see here, and it is important that you understand the differentiation now. We have here had a market equilibrium which is distorted by some event or by some changes, and then we get a new equilibrium, and the market moves from one equilibrium to the other, and both equilibria are efficient equilibria in the sense that the sum of consumer surpluses and producer surpluses are maximized, but nevertheless the move from A to B produces winner and losers, but it can be shown, I cannot derive it here, the gains of the winners is higher than the loss of the losers. If you go here from point A to point B, jetzt. If you go, no, let's me here. If you go from this point to this point here, from A to B, both points are efficient, but if you go from A to B, you have winners and losers. And then the question, of course, is, can we still justify, under such conditions, the freedom of contract? See? Because it's not anymore Pareto improving. Now I come to the so-called technical external effects. The technical external effects are different. Technical negative. The negative effect on productivity is something which reduces the productivity of other resources. Now, I give you a simple example. If the steel mill pollutes all the meadows in the vicinity of 20 kilometers, let's say, then the quality of food might be affected, right? Or the quality of the land in general. Might be the land cannot be used anymore at all. So this is a real loss in productivity which did not occur in the first example. And therefore comes an important differentiation here between the external effects and the pecuniary effects. When we have only, as long as we have pecuniary effects by a change in the market, we have winners and losers, but it is certain that the winners win more than the losers lose. So we have the Calder-Hicks efficiency criterion fulfilled. However, if we have technical external effects, then we might have fair contracts, we might have winners and losers, we have winners and losers, but the losers might lose more than the winners taken together. So that is inefficient. So it can, for instance, be that economic development in a country leads to high growth rates nominally on paper, but the degradation of the environment is so high that it is higher than the whole growth. So for instance, I came, it's a time ago, it does not depict the present situation there, but some years ago, there was an article which said that at that time the country of Indonesia had a growth rate of 7% of its national product. And one scholar pointed out that much of this was only due to deforestation, and plundering the environment, and that the real growth rate in the country at the time was not 7%, but if you deducted these losses, was even 0%. There was no growth at all, but that does not show up in the show up in the national account statistics. Therefore, we can say the following. We can say we have three types of contracts, three types of fair contracts. We have fair contracts which lead to a gain of all contractual parties, which can be expressed by the surplus, the sum total of the consumer and producer surplus. If these contracts have no third-party effects, then this is a strong case from an economic point of view to introduce freedom of contract. Then we have contracts fair contracts, I'm only talking about fair contracts here, fair contracts which increase the sum total, the surplus of the contracting parties, but which lead to negative pecuniary effects without in any way changing or reducing the productivity of resources. Then the freedom of contract would lead to an increasing surplus, but it could also lead to winners and losers. It is, however, guaranteed that the gain of the winners is higher than the loss of the losers, and that therefore such improvements or such changes are still called a Calder-Hicks improvement. If they are a Calder-Hicks improvement, there is still some rationale for it, but the rationale is not as strong as for the Pareto improvement, of course. And then we have contracts which also lead to a gain for the parties, because they are increase the surplus, the consumer and producer surplus, but they might lead to negative external effects, and it is nothing guarantees that the overall effect of such contracts is positive in a welfare economic sense. They can be neither Pareto improvement, nor they can even be a Calder-Hicks detriment. And of course here the legitimacy of the legal system to cut into contracts and to restrict the freedom of contract is the highest. But some legitimacy also applies if we have only pecuniary effects. I want to, my last point here on this point is that when it comes to globalization, we live in an area of globalization, WTO rules. And I think most economists support the idea of globalization because the globalization leads to efficiency, efficiency increases. But on the other hand, globalization also leads to winners and losers. We have losers and winners, and sometimes the losers lose a lot. And if the losers lose a lot, and if this view of general compensation, that you are sometimes a loser, sometimes a winner, and that cancels out, and at the end of the day you will always be a winner, that is not the case for globalization. And therefore, in my view, one of the biggest shortcomings at all of globalization is that the WTO rules have no, so far at least, no mechanisms for compensating the losers from globalization, which would easily be possible from the gains of the winners. So we have globalization and winners, and we have globalization and losers, but no, so far no mechanism exists in WTO to do anything to compensate the losers. I think that is one of, in my view, one of the great challenges of the future, because otherwise the whole idea of globalization might become buried under an increasing waves of nationalism, of economic nationalism. So now let me proceed to the economic function of contract law. So far I have specified the economic function of contracts. Now I come to contract law. What is contract law all about? Now, when we look at contract law in the books, then it is necessary, first of all, to differentiate between two types of norms, namely mandatory contract rules and default rules. Can you tell me what the difference between the two is? Contract law consists only of, is a set of rules, and we have two subsets, mandatory and default rules, yes? Pardon?
Free consent, like it should be free from any coercion or undue influence and all. That is mandatory. Or you should have a consideration, give and take.
Mandatory is imperative to comply, and imperativeness is there is default and default.
Yes, you know, mandatory rules in civil law in general, or in contract law, apply also to contract law, are rules which are not at the discretion of the parties. Parties have to comply with these rules. So, for instance, a mandatory rule is the rule that a minor cannot make a contract. So, if a minor makes a contract to his own protection, this is nil and void, whatever he says. Yeah, see? That is a mandatory rule. And what is a default rule? Pardon?
Consequences followed by default.
Pardon?
Consequences will be followed by default.
Yeah, what does by default mean here?
The parties can consent out of those default rules. They can they can consent to such a term which is against what is stated in the statute.
If X will be happen, then certain Y will be.
Yeah, now assume we have a particular rule in contract law. For instance, the rule which we have in all contract laws in the world, that the partner, the contractual partner, who owes the specific performance cannot deliver partially. Now, for instance, assume I'm a supermarket and you are a farmer, and I buy from you 5,000 bags of wheat, or let's say of rice, 5,000 bags, and we have a contract that this rice has to be delivered on a particular after a particular date. Then it is not, I have not to accept, if you were the rice dealer and said, well, I bring you 300 bags today and another 500 tomorrow and another 500 a week later and so on. This is what we call partial delivery. And the reason for that is also very simple, that it disrupts too much my business. You should deliver at once, everything at once, right? That you have in all contract laws. But this is a default rule. So if you are the seller, let's say, and you say, you know, I cannot deliver the 5,000 bags on one day. I must do it in 5 days. Can you agree with that? And I agree, then we changed it. You see? Default rules, they apply only if the parties do not deviate from them. Therefore, they are called rules by default. If the parties default not to negotiate anything else, they are default rules. And now, when we talk about the default rules, that is now first our most important thing, because most, 90%, I would say more than 90% of all rules of contract law are default rules, not mandatory rules. So we talk about the default rules. Then the question is, what are the default rules for? Why are they, what are they good for? And to understand this, it is necessary now that we get acquainted with a basic concept, with a basic idea of the economic analysis of contract law. Oh, sorry, I have to stay here. That is the so-called fully specified contract. The fully specified contract. What does this fully specified contract mean? A contract is always not only about the specific performance and the definition of the specific performance and the price, but between a contract formation and the delivery, and even after that, there are risks. Many risks can pop up. For instance, if you produce something, you have the risk that all of a sudden a strike hits you and you cannot deliver. Who should take such a risk? Should the buyer or the seller, the producer, take that risk? Or it could be that all of a sudden, you know, you buy something, you want to sell it, but you discover that the market breaks down for, let's say, a highly fashionable product. You buy the saris, for instance, and then you discover the Indian women don't want the saris anymore. And you have now, who bears this risk that all of a sudden, you know, the tastes of consumers change? Then you have, for instance, the risk that for whatever reason there's a, let's say, in your company, there is a fire breaks out and you cannot produce for 2 weeks. Who bears that risk, the buyer or the seller? Or you have the risk that all of a sudden your bank tells you, you know, for whatever reason, we cannot prolong your credit line and you cannot pay for 3 months. Who bears that risk? Or you produce something which, in good faith, which, however, the quality is lower than stipulated in the contract. Who bears that risk? And who should, what should the remedy for that be? Or you produce something, for instance, you produce a machine, right? You are a producer of a machine, and the buyer, the machine costs €1 million, and the buyer, you deliver the machine, and the machine does not work. So you, of course, you have to repair the machine that it works, but the buyer tells you now, well, you know, I have this machine was part of a flow, of a production flow. So we could not produce anything because at this point the production flow was disconnected. We couldn't produce anything, and that cost us 15 million euros. Then you have the repair cost. They got 1 million euros for the machine and 15 million euros for the interruption of the supply cost. Who bears that risk? In other words, what we can say, the whole idea of contract law is to allocate risk between the two parties. There are so many risks, especially if contracts span time and space. Of course, if you go to the market, you know, to the and you just have buy nuts on the market over the counter transaction, then there is no risk. But the real thing, the real contract, you have lots and lots and lots of risk. And these risks have to be specified. They have to be allocated to one or the other side. And that is what contract law is good for, to specify the risks. Now, and the question is now, how will the party specify this risk? Will they just try, when they negotiate, to shift the risk to the other party? I have asked my own law students in Hamburg, how would you allocate the risk of the producer of eggs, let's say a egg farmer, that an egg is foul. Can always happen, right? So this is one risk, one out of thousands of risks. Now assume now that transaction costs are zero. We make the Coasean assumption. So you can, both parties make a contract and they hire a busload, each party, of highly paid lawyers, the best lawyers in the world. Every one of them gets 700 euros per billed hour. But the 700 euros per billed hour are paid by some, you know, some third party, some unknown source, you know, because we assume that the transaction costs are zero. And now these lawyers, they would now make a full list of all the risks which can be associated with the contract, right? So they will arrive at the end of the day with a list of with a full list of all possible and impossible risks. And then they will negotiate. They have a list, let's say 5,000 risks are there, and they start with risk number 1, and then they say, who should bear risk number 1? And the idea to say that they want always, one party wants to shift the risk to the other side is totally crazy, because not in line with economic thinking. Now assume that you have a particular risk, and the risk is, that is the probability times the damage, in case of a damage, the expected loss of this risk is 100 rupees or 100 million rupees, whatever. So the expected loss is 100. Now assume that party 1 can reduce, can alleviate, can eliminate the risk with some technology, with some allocating some, in making some investment against the risk or insuring the risk, and the cost of that are 20. And the other can do the same thing, but for the other party the costs are 40. Then we can say, so we have a risk expected cost of 100, but they can be reduced to 0 with an investment of either 40 or 20. So then it is of course efficient that the party who has the cost of 20 takes the risk. Now comes the question, why is the party willing to take the risk, and why will they agree, both parties, that the party who is the cheapest cost avoider for the risk takes the risk?
Contract value will be shifted. If the party is willing to take risk of taking goods, its consideration should go up a bit.
Yes, but why should party A say, okay, I'm willing to invest 20, then I have cost of 20, but you save 40. So why should I accept cost of 20 only because you save 40?
Maybe the other party could pay the first party, say 10 rupees, and they could share this, then come to the cheapest solution.
Now, assume that the producer is the cheapest cost avoider, right? Has the 20. Then the producer will say this. He says, look, the price for the product is 1,000. But there is a risk of 100. When I can reduce this risk with cost of 20, but then I have to increase the price by 20, right? Because otherwise I lose money. But what is the alternative? The alternative is that I do not, you get it for 1,000, not for 1,020, the product. And either you do nothing, then you have a risk of 100, so you pay 1,000 plus 100. So your real cost is not 1,000 or 1,020, but 1,100. Or you invest into the risk, then your real costs are 1,040. So it is a win-win situation that this risk is taken by the seller or by the producer and not by the buyer. Both make a gain from it. You see what I mean? And that you have to understand if you understand contracts. Otherwise you will never end up in anything substantial. That is the first thing I tell all my students at Bucerius Law School. And they are very smart, and most of them go to the large law firms, I tell them, you must understand this, that the allocation of risk is not a zero-sum game. You know, one party loses, the one party gains, but that it is a game in which both parties can win. And therefore, if you have a risk of 100 and party A can reduce the risk with cost of 20, the other with cost of 40, then the party A will take the risk in its own interest. It is in the social interest, but it is also in the party A's interest because it can increase the price. And therefore, I always also tell, sometimes I give talks for lawyers, you know, who have long experience. And I ask them, so when you make about this risk, yeah, they understand this, but they say still sometimes we have to try to shift the risk to the other party, even if it is unreasonable. And I say, why? Yeah, they say, well, you know, it is sometimes like this. The managers of our companies, they meet, they make a contract. Let's say Airbus company sells Airbuses to Lufthansa, and they say, well, one Airbus costs so and so much, let's say 100 million euros costs one Airbus. So they order 20 Airbuses, 2 billion, fixed price. And then they say, well, our lawyers now, they should make the details of the contract. But they have not the authority to change the prices. And that, of course, then makes the negotiating a pure zero-sum game if they cannot change prices. So I always tell them, these lawyers in Hamburg, you must insist when you work when you are in the in the law department, you must instruct your lawyers that they cannot fix the prices before all the risks are allocated, because the risks are part of the service and part of the whole package what you deliver. And therefore, you know, decent people will, in their own interest, if they are rational, they will always allocate the risk to the cheapest cost avoider, and not, you know, to the other part. They will not try to. They will accept the risk if they are a cheapest cost avoider because it is in their interest, and they will shift the risk to the other party because it is also in their interest. And if they do this not only with one risk, but also with risk number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on, then the end result is what we call the fully specified contract. That is the contract in which all the risks are allocated according to the cheapest cost avoider principle and in the to the mutual benefit. The fully specified contract is a contract in which contract law is not necessary, but of course it requires zero transaction cost. Now, where do we have such fully specified contracts? Of course, transaction costs are never zero, like in the Coase world, but we have cases of so-called high transaction. If we have high transaction values, let's say Airbus sells 30 airplanes to Lufthansa, and the contract volume is 3-4 billion euros. That is what I mean with high value transaction. And then, even if both companies pay 3-4 weeks a full busload of lawyers each with their high billed hours, the transaction costs are simply not the absolute transaction cost, but the relative transaction costs in relation to the transaction volume are still a small percentage of a percent of the total transaction value, of the total transaction. And these high-value transactions, these are the cases in which we have not 100%, but almost 100% fully specified contracts. I once went with a student group to Airbus, to the law department, and it was quite interesting what this guy there, was the director of the law department, told us. He said, well, we have, for instance, for an Airbus, we have different warranty rules, different warranty contracts for almost every part of the airplane. For the wings, they are different than for the machine. And for the interior, you know, the sofas and the seats and so on, they are different. And for the cockpit, they are different and so on. So they have alone 50, 60 different regulation rules. What happens if one of these things does not properly work and so on. You know. And that goes on and on with the financial matters and everything. And they fix everything. They do not need a law, except of course, for knowing the mandatory rules. They must also comply with the mandatory rule. But otherwise, they fix a fully specified contract. However, that is only possible because the transaction costs are close to zero. Not absolutely, they are very high, but relatively, as a percentage of the transaction value, they are negligible. Now, and that is my last sentence, now the question is, what happens if transaction costs are not so low as in the high transaction values? Then, for that, it is simply too costly to write a fully specified contract. And for that, we have the default rule. And therefore, a good contract law is a contract law which tries to mimic the fully specified contract. And the best contract law is a contract law which brings, without negotiating and without actually allocating the risks of the contract to one party, brings the risk distribution as close as possible to the fully specified contract. That is the highest rationale for contract law is to mimic the fully specified contract. So with that, I will conclude for today.